In this episode, we're going to discuss rationality as the primary virtue from Chapter 7 in Leonard Peikoff's Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. Stay tuned. All right, so let's dive into this section with a summary. So we start out with the three primary values of objectivism that are going to be the kind of core things that we pursue in order to live, and that's reason, purpose, and self-esteem. And here we're going to focus on reason. In later sections, we'll focus on purpose and self-esteem. But to value reason means to value the faculty of reason. It means to value your mind, to treat it as something that you're going to act to gain in or keep. And so then the perspective of rationality is this is the virtue, the primary virtue by which you're going to act to gain or keep all values, and above all, the value of reason. So what is rationality? Well, rationality, Ayn Rand puts it this way: it's the recognition and acceptance of reason as one's only source of knowledge, one's only judge of values, and one's only guide to action. So it's with knowledge, values, action, all of these you're going to guide by the use of reason, by the use of your mind, because it is your means of survival. And that's contrasted briefly by Leonard with the opposite, and that's the policy of irrationality, which is the turning off of your mind, the looking away from reality, and he has more to say about that shortly. But then it's every virtue we get has both kind of an inner and outer aspect, and so the inner policy, the kind of mental side of rationality, is to be what Ayn Rand called a conceptualizer. And here's one of my favorite quotes by her, so I'll just give it, that I think really cashes out what it means to be rational, what it means to take rationality as a life policy seriously. It involves an actively sustained process of identifying one's impressions in conceptual terms, of integrating every event and every observation into a conceptual context, of grasping relationships, differences, similarities in one's perceptual material, and of abstracting them into new concepts, of drawing inferences, of making deductions, of reaching conclusions, of asking new questions and discovering new answers, and expanding one's knowledge into an ever-growing sum. And the contrast now we get a deeper perspective on is evasion. So that is what it means to be irrational. And we've had discussions about evasion in the past under free will. And I'll have more to say about it in a little bit, but just to underscore, it's effortful unawareness. It's the effortful turning away from reality, summoning the fog, is the quote from Atlas Shrugged. So that's on the intellectual side. On the existential side, it means to follow reason. It means that in all of one's actions, you're going to act on the basis of the conclusions of your mind. And in particular, we get a discussion of that it's to be a disciple of causality. And that means never seeking to get causes without accepting the effects, never seeking effects without enacting the causes, and never reversing causality. That is, acting as if we can achieve a cause by gaining an effect. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And we end with a discussion about the relation of reason and emotion. And part of rationality is the recognition that it should be reason first, then emotion. So it's not anti-emotion, but it's reason is your means of reaching knowledge, reaching values, and guiding your action. And then your emotions follow from that. And they give you information, but it's your mind that has to judge it. And so the proper outcome of that is that a person who is pro-reason, who is rational, who doesn't act on emotion, is the person who can experience emotions in their full intensity, because he's the only kind of person who's not racked by conflict. Remember, conflict is I'm pulled in this direction, I'm pulled in that direction. I can't give myself over fully to anything, and therefore I can't experience the full fiery joy of achievement or the kind of full sadness or anguish or anger that can come when our values are attacked or we lose them. So I don't have that much to say on the kind of positives of rationality. In part, it's kind of building on what we've talked about before, and it will be expanded upon in what comes later. And I think Leonard's presentation of it here is really good and addresses a lot of the key points. But I do want to say a few things. So number one, remember we've talked several times about the way in which, from Objectivism's perspective, every norm, every should is a product of two basic things, which is a goal and certain metaphysically given facts. And so it's, if you want this and these are the facts, then you should act in the following way. And here you can think about it as the metaphysically given facts are really the foundations of philosophy. You have that existence exists, reason works, and only reason works. And so if we're to live, we need to live by reason. Or you could think about it as it's the integration of man's life as the moral standard and reason as man's basic means of survival. And if you remember our discussion of reason as man's basic means of survival, we said this is the central idea in Objectivism. And now I think it should be a lot clearer why. If reason is our basic means of survival, then that, and rationality then is going to be our basic virtue, then that's going to color everything else about how we should live, how we should act, how we should value. And so how then you would ultimately organize a society. So it is just the kind of central perspective, and then rationality is cashing that out in terms of a virtue, in terms of active guidance about how to live. And so from Objectivism's perspective, to be moral is to be a thinker. That's the essence of morality, but not a thinker in the Platonic sense of, if you sometimes hear the phrase the life of the mind, and you get the idea of like somebody off in Plato's cave or sitting in their rocking chair reading a book. But a life of the mind for Ayn Rand is an active, value pursuing kind of life, a productive life, a life that blends or integrates the spiritual and the material, that is pro-emotion, pro-passion. And so it's very different from kind of this Platonic conception, but that at every stage, what is directing you as a value-pursuing organism is your mind. It's directing your cognition, it's directing your value judgments, and thereby what is shaping your action. Now, in terms of some of the specifics, so in her book, The Virtuous Egoist, or Ayn Rand's Normative Ethics, The Virtuous Egoist, Tara Smith goes into great detail about all the virtues, and I just kind of wanted to go over what she isolates as the practical demands of rationality, as she calls it. And I think you see all these things in what Leonard covers, but I found it helpful to kind of break them out into list form. So one is that rationality demands focus, so that at root, what it means to be rational in terms of what is the thing that we have direct control over in terms of being rational is to bring our mind into full focus. And of course, we talked about that in quite a lot of detail under free will. But it's the way to think about it is that focused awareness on reality is what it means to be rational. And everything else that we articulate in this section is really spelling out what it means to kind of carry out that primary choice of focus. If you're going to turn to reality and try to understand it, what does it really mean in different areas? So it's starting with focus, but then some of the implications. So we get to her next to the practical demands is to expand one's knowledge. So you're not in focus, you're not being rational, you're not guiding your life by reason and treating the faculty of reason as a value if you're not actively working to expand your knowledge. If it's just, well, I've got, the knowledge that I learned up through college and I'm going to kind of coast along on that, or maybe the first few years of my job, as we'll talk about when we get to productivity. If you think about productiveness as ambition in the pursuit of wealth, rationality is going to be ambition in the pursuit of knowledge, including knowledge about values, including knowledge that is introspective, knowledge about your own soul and your own emotions. It's the constant desire to know more because, of course, our whole goal is to govern ourselves through the world. And the more we can see of the world, the better we can govern ourselves and the more successful and happy we can be. And so I always think of just both focus and more widely rationality as, if you want to take, it's not exactly an analogy, but a sort of symbol of it. I think I might have even given this when we talked about free will, but it's, if you've ever woken up in a hotel room and it's pitch black, it's, man, if I had a light to guide myself through, I wouldn't be bumping into things and all of this. And this is what it means to expand your knowledge. It's to get a brighter and brighter light and to see more and more. And then she stresses the next point, it's acting by reason. So again, it's not just reaching conclusions and then sitting around and going, aha, I feel the pleasure of having learned something. It's ultimately all for the purpose of action. It's all for the purpose of value pursuit. And so this will be spelled out more, particularly when we get to integrity. But if you'll recall our discussion of reason as man's basic means of survival, one of the things I really highlighted there was this point that reason is an action guiding, valuing faculty. It is the faculty that's going to allow us to project goals and long range goals that then we're going to direct ourselves towards by reason. But it's all for the purpose of reaching destinations, of getting someplace, this is why one of the reasons why I like this metaphor of governing yourself through a dark room. So it's not just sitting in a chair and turning on a light bulb and staring at the walls. No, I'm trying to get somewhere, and the better I can see, the better I can get to where I'm going, and the better destinations I can spot. Because the one thing I don't like about the analogy of the hotel room is there's not a lot of cool places to go in your hotel room. But if you think about a world in darkness, and then if you had a little flashlight versus you had a blazing sun, there's just so much more that's open to you and so much more efficacious action you can engage in. And that is what rationality is encouraging and calling our attention to and ultimately demanding of us if we want to live. Absolutism is the next item on Tara's list, and that is the idea that rationality means rationality all the time, on every issue, no exceptions. And part of what Leonard talks about in OPAR is the way in which a single exception left uncorrected, a single evasion that you don't correct and that you try to insulate and maintain and just treat as an exception, ultimately invalidates your mind. And why? Well, precisely because it's the opposite of cognition. Cognition, as we talked about under objectivity, is integration. It is integration between all the items of knowledge in your mind, and then integration down to reality through the process of reduction. And so that to engage in evasion and then to double down on it and not correct it and let it stand is ultimately not to have that self-control of knowing, yes, I'm in touch with reality. It means you might be by accident, but now it is an accident. It's an accident because you are not in charge of this area of your mind, and this area may impact other areas. And since you're not thinking about it, you're not integrating your knowledge, you don't know that. So that reason has to be treated as an absolute. And indeed, all virtues are going to have to be treated as an absolute, because one perspective we're going to see about the irrational, about the evil, is that it's precisely the inconsistent. That to be evil or immoral or irrational, all of which are different perspectives on the same phenomenon, is to try to get away with living, as Ayn Rand puts it in Galt's speech. And it's the get away with means making exceptions and being inconsistent. And so if we want to achieve values, if we want to go by reason, going by reason means as an absolute, unconditionally. It's that I'm going to face reality unconditionally, not if it feels good, not if I like the answers, not if it's easy, but unconditionally, my goal is to turn on that light as bright as I possibly can. And then finally, this is kind of the inverse of all of these. It's rationality is renouncing emotionalism. And again, it's not renouncing emotion, it's renouncing emotionalism, treating emotions as tools of cognition, as tools for determining our values, as tools for guiding our actions. And again, it's because emotions, they're not bad, but they don't have the ability to judge their own relationship to reality. And so when you're acting in the grips of an emotion, you're acting blindly. And blindness, another way of saying that, is you're acting out of focus, without awareness, and you're going to crash into something eventually if you're on that kind of policy. Something really interesting I heard many years ago in a lecture by Darrell Wright that then was incorporated into a chapter in Essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged was the development of Rand's thinking. She, during the Fountainhead, regarded independence as the primary virtue. And by Atlas Shrugged, she gets to its rationality as the primary virtue. And he discusses the kind of evolution of her thinking. And he notes that she certainly saw reason as man's basic means of survival during the time of the Fountainhead. But the question then is, well, what changed in regarding independence as the primary virtue? And so let me just read a quote from Darrell's chapter that gets to this issue. Because essentially what he says is that it's her theory of free will that becomes fully clarified and worked out in between the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged that is going to give us rationality as the primary virtue. So this is Darrell. But she does not appear to consider the choice to suspend one's judgment a psychologically realistic one on desert island cases. So he's talking about the time of the Fountainhead, and it's that she gets that a person can evade, they can suspend their judgment, but she doesn't think that that's something that somebody would do unless they were in a position to substitute something for their own judgment, i.e. other people. So going on with the quote, in society, she thinks suspending one's judgment is a realistic possibility since one has the apparent, but actually only temporary, alternative of think or be supported by the thinking of others. The presence of others, she seems to assume, supplies a potential motive for non-thinking that would be absent on a desert island. Why is this? She seems to be making two assumptions about those who choose to be dependent on the thinking of others. And again, she's making these assumptions in the Fountainhead era, not in the Atlas Shrugged era. First, that they need... First, that they have nothing against thinking per se. Second, that they do want to live. In that case, if such a person found himself on a desert island, he might wish there was someone else there to do his thinking for him, but he would choose to think rather than allow himself to perish. But, Darrell says, as we will see, these are two assumptions about dependent people that Rand will later modify. One way to put this is that by the time of Atlas Shrugged, Rand gains a deeper perspective on the phenomenon of evil, and above all on its source, its root in free will. So she's going to question this idea that there's people who have nothing against thinking per se, but it's just easier to rely on somebody else. And she's going to get the idea, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, of what she'll call the anti-effort mentality. And then she'll challenge this idea that everybody wants to live, and that a core part of Atlas Shrugged, as hopefully you know, is that no, not everybody does want to live. And we'll talk about that more too. In fact, really what I want to talk about for the rest of this video is her view of evil, because I don't think her analysis of evil is widely understood, and it's one of her most fascinating perspectives, part philosophical, part psychological, and it also encouraged me to delve a lot more deeply into Galt's speech and read it more carefully and think about it a lot. And I'm going to talk about some implications of that for this series, but also just for you generally. But before we get to that, why should we be interested in evil besides the fact that Ayn Rand had a theory and we're interested in Ayn Rand? And the basic answer is to understand the world. You can't understand the world, I think, and make sense of certain things and important things if you don't have an understanding of evil. So one thing you might think of is you can't understand the history of the 20th century and totalitarianism, and you can think specifically of something like the horrors of Nazism, but also communism, if you don't understand evil. And if evil was primarily confined to criminals, as I think people tend to view it, it's too easy to say, well, they're crazy. And a lot of people do say, well, they're crazy. That was insane. And it's in effect dismissing something they can't understand and trying to write it off as, well, I don't really have to think about this and work to understand it because there's some people in the world who are just crazy. But you couldn't make sense of a nation, a civilized, developed nation, in the case of Germany, that engages in atrocities, not if you don't have a view of evil. And so we can't write that off and just say it's crazy. But then even at a personal level, you need it in self-protection. You can think, for instance, about Dagny's error. Her error was precisely that she did not grasp the nature of evil. And it was for that reason sanctioning it and exposing herself to it and allow it to undercut her values. But even just in real life, like for instance, my parents got into a business relationship with somebody and they bought a business from him, and he turned out to be evil, and he made their life a living nightmare until he died. And so the better you are at understanding evil, I think the easier it is to spot, and the more you can have a policy of, well, how should one deal with the evil? And we'll say a little bit about that in this video, but that's really part of the theme of Atlas Shrugged. And the whole idea of the sanction of the victim is the idea of what you cannot do under any circumstances is give the evil your sanction. And one final point I'll note, or I guess two final points. So one is to spot bad motives in yourself. And I don't mean this kind of Jordan Peterson-like thing, like you have this, Nazi lurking in your soul. Although I think for a lot of people, there's an element of that they should be in the watch for. And it's not that we all have some shadow self, but evil is a human potential. And as a human being, you need to be aware of anything in your soul that is even hinting at that potential. And so even take, like a passing moment of schadenfreude. It's not that you berate yourself and say, oh, I'm low and evil and sinful, but you want to spot that and think, was this just something completely out of context, or is there a premise there that I really want to challenge and unearth? Because that's a really bad thing to have, lurking around down in the basement, if you want to put it that way. And then finally, I would say it's her theory of evil is worth studying because it helps us understand ideas. Because Objectivism's view is not just people can be evil, but their products can be evil. That if you recall our discussion of the metaphysical and the man-made, it was you can't judge the man-made uncritically, that these are human products, and part of judging them is to judge not just true or false, but good or evil. Does this conform to reality or not? And if not, and it's bad. And if it doesn't conform to reality beyond a certain point, it's genuinely evil. And this, by the way, was kind of central to the disagreement with David Kelly and Leonard Peikoff that Leonard wrote about in Fact and Value, where Kelly essentially, although he has some hedge words, he treats morally judging ideas as wrong. It's not, we primarily judge them as true and false, but they're man-made products, and you have to judge the man-made morally, and the people advocating ideas morally. And we'll talk about like the way in which evil ideas are concocted by evil people and propagated in order to achieve evil. And if you're treating ideas as, well, moral judgment, that's just kind of like for dogmatists and something like that. That is I mean, it's a real sanctioning of evil, and it's devastating to human beings to do that. And part of what it shows is that you don't take ideas seriously. Because remember, the primary source of a moral judgment is not like some extra added layer added on to true or false. It's that the true is the good. And so in order to not judge an idea morally, you can't really even judge it cognitively. You have to be treating ideas as cut off from reality, as rationalistic games. And I mean, frankly, I see that borne out by, the legacy of Kelly and his followers. But even apart from him, what we're going to see is that and what we want to appreciate is the role of ideas in causing evil and the way in which evil uses ideas. And that will be really illuminating as part of Ayn Rand's theory, and hopefully in our ability to go through life. Now, the one question would be, why is evil hard to understand? I mentioned that good people want to dismiss the whole phenomenon of evil. Not always, right? But some of them do. And when you get kind of accounts of they're crazy, but not just they're crazy. Any sort of, if you've ever read, and you should read Ayn Rand's article on the cult of moral grayness, I think part of the reason people are attracted to the view of nothing's black or white, it's all gray. Part of it is the kind of moral cowardice and not wanting to live up to being fully good. I think that's the major part of it. But I also think that part of it is the fear of really grasping and taking seriously what evil is. And if not the fear, then at least the kind of bafflement and the inability to project evil. And if you think, there's the kind of view that I hear a lot, particularly amongst people who study fiction writing or screenwriting, that, well, everyone's the hero of their own story, and what evil would be is that kind of like stock villain character who's very self-aware of his evil and basically, laughing maniacally as he creates havoc for no reason other than to create havoc. And that's definitely true, that kind of thing doesn't exist. Or, I mean, if it does exist, that probably is usually some kind of serious mental illness. But that, if you remember our discussion of free will, one of the points that I made there when I discussed briefly Ayn Rand's view of evil is that it's deliberate but not fully conscious. Or to put it differently, it's deliberate unconsciousness. It's a deliberate state of being driven by your whims. And so if you think about Ayn Rand's whole theory of free will, which is what this kind of view of evil is going to come out of, it's that one can lower one's level of awareness. One can do so deliberately. One can exert effort not to see. And so it's deliberate. It's something you're choosing, and you're choosing with some sense that, yeah, I'm putting myself out of control and putting myself and allowing myself to be in the grips of my emotions. And so there's a blindness to it and a not full recognition of the evil you're committing, but it's a state that you're putting yourself into, and you have a sense that there's something going on here that doesn't feel clean and uplifting, to put it that way. So we'll get into more of an analysis of this in a second, but I do want to recommend a few resources. As I said, there's Daryl Wright's piece, has some good stuff on it, and that's in... I think the title is Ayn Rand's, here I have in my notes, Ayn Rand's Ethics from the Fountainhead to Atlas Shrugged, in Essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, edited by Robert Mayhew. Then there's obviously the biggest source of this is Ayn Rand's novels, and particularly Galt's Speech is where you get the fullest, most in-depth perspective on her view of evil. And in her nonfiction, I'll name a few, but the one I want to stress is The Age of Envy. And I highly recommend reading Galt's Speech, the sections on evil, in conjunction with The Age of Envy, because it's really the same material, but it's and the Galt Speech one in effect goes deeper and more metaphysical, but that also makes it a little less relatable in terms of seeing it in the world. And so I like reading both of them, because you get the deepest, most philosophic perspective in Atlas Shrugged. And then you get the same perspective, but in more journalistic terms, even if you want to think of it that way. And those two together are really the most illuminating. A few others where she talks about this, Comprachicos, which is also in Return of the Primitive, as is Age of Envy, The Monument Builders, Requiem for Man, and there's touches of it throughout a lot of her work. Her piece on Marilyn Monroe and Marilyn Monroe's death discusses this. Then, while she was colleagues with Nathaniel Branden, he gave a series of lectures on objectivism that are now available both in book form and online. Now, these were recorded after they split, and so to my knowledge, nobody knows if there's changes in the content. Now, part of Ayn Rand's complaint was Branden never revised the damn lectures while she was with him, so it's hard to imagine he did a lot of revisions afterward. But in any case, it's not officially part of objectivism. But in those lectures, which, again, if you search for Nathaniel Branden and The Nature of Evil, or a book, The Vision of Ayn Rand by Branden, you can get what are likely, or at least very close to, a lecture on Rand's view of the nature of evil that she would have agreed with, and has a lot of interesting observations and things that you can't get anywhere else. Just in general, all of those lectures, most of it is stuff that's in the nonfiction, but there's lots of little observations and examples that I found really interesting, fascinating, clarifying. So I do recommend that book, even if you can't. It's nothing like OPAR in terms of presenting objectivism as a full system, but there's just a lot of neat touches and insights that are really worth really worth looking at. And it's just historically, if you're interested in objectivism, getting, this is kind of what was being taught about the philosophy to people right after Atlas Shrugged is published. Then probably my personal favorite piece, not by Ayn Rand, on this issue is an essay by Onkar Ghate. This is in Robert Mayhew's Essays on Ayn Rand's We the Living, and it's called The Death Premise in We the Living and Atlas Shrugged. And Onkar is, again, following very closely the kind of analysis that Rand gives explicitly in Galt's speech, but doing it through the events of We the Living and Atlas Shrugged. And in effect, concretizing each aspect. So one of the things, and I'll probably talk about more about this, whether in this video or in a future one that I intend to do that's really focused on Galt's speech. But one of the things he's pointed out, and I think he's referencing the Barbara Branden biography, where she, from Who is Ayn Rand, published when they were colleagues, that Barbara Branden pointed out is that every single statement in Galt's speech was concretized in the novel, but we don't have footnotes pointing to you to those examples of concretization. And so what you get with Onkar's essay is you get the essential pieces of Ayn Rand's presentation of evil with examples from two of her novels. And so I found it just insanely helpful in getting clear on this issue. And it's hard to say it's an enjoyable read because it's about evil, but it's just so illuminating about the issue of evil and how Ayn Rand thinks about it. And then finally, I'll say that I have what I think is a pretty good treatment, though it doesn't go as deep, in Equal is Unfair that I wrote with Yaron Brook. And in that book, we look at how egalitarianism, which is the philosophy motivating modern attacks on income inequality, is a version of, as Ayn Rand would put it, though I don't know that we use this phrase in there, hatred of the good for being the good, and give some, I think, some good concretizations, and I think a few new, if not totally new insights, at least new formulations. But I think there's some good stuff in there, and it's actually one of my favorite things that I ever wrote, the chapter that it's from, which is the last major chapter in the book. So what is evil? And in Branden's lectures on evil, he makes the point that the starting point has to be a definition of the good. And it's only by contrast to the good that you can get a definition of the evil. And so if the good is that which promotes human life and happiness, achievement and enjoyment of life, then the evil is that which is opposed to human life. And it's destruction of values, and not destruction of values for the sake of for a real positive, but it's destruction of values as in itself. It's the anti-life, what Ayn Rand calls the death premise. And I think it's helpful, just before we get into our analysis, I've given some indication of examples of this in reality, but I want to highlight in particular the idea of evidence of destruction for the sake of destruction, or hatred of the good for being the good. And now this is one thing that Ayn Rand gives just a ton of concretes on in The Age of Envy, but just a few examples. In Ayn Rand's novels, we have that Andre, in We the Living, he views communism as causing destruction, but he thinks it's for the sake of a better future. And and the way he puts it is that, we're going to raise all men to the mountaintops, not just, a few. And what he grasps is that, no, it's what we're actually doing is not leading all men to a positive future, but we're tearing down the best of men. And so the communism is seen by him as tearing down for the sake of tearing down, that he realizes that his colleagues, they have no illusions that this is leading anywhere positive. It's that they're motivated precisely in that communism gives them permission, and the regime gives them the protection to tear down values, the good, for the sake of the good. And that you don't see them concerned with any positives. And it's the same thing with Dagny, or rather, I'm sorry, not Dagny, James Taggart. Part of the process that you see throughout Atlas Shrugged is the way in which, he's constantly tearing things down. And earlier in the novel, you get the sense, and he tells himself, well, I'm doing it for easy money. But by the end of the book, he realizes that no, that's not true. It's that this money that I allegedly care about, I'm blowing it on drinks for, I'm going blank, Oran Boyle. And, it's disappearing as fast as I get it. And it's not really what I'm after. It's not really what I'm about. And that it's a increasing realization that his goal is for somebody like Francisco to lose his fortune. That's really motivating Taggart. And then ultimately, even deeper than that, what we get in the final scene of Atlas Shrugged, and I hope I've said spoilers alert, and I can't believe that anybody would get this far in OPAR and my videos without having read the novel and had it spoiled somewhere else. But in any case, in the final torture scene with Galt, he gets is the full realization and coming to terms with the fact that he wants to murder Galt, knowing that his own death will follow from that. And that's the kind of pure, stark, naked form of evil. And James Taggart, facing this about himself, goes crazy and has a complete mental breakdown because he recognized that he's moved by such a vile purpose, that it's destroying the good for the sake of the good, and ultimately that what he's really lusting after is his own death, that it's his self-hatred that's driving him to kill that which stands as a reproach to him because it is good. We'll have more to say about all that, but in real life, you could think of, the most stark example would be something like the Nazi concentration camps, of like digging ditches and filling them back up. And Jordan Peterson actually has a really good analysis of this. And I think there's many overlaps between his understanding of evil and Ayn Rand's, particularly, the way he puts it is that it's, the motivation is inflicting suffering for the sake of suffering. And I think that's right. And in fact, he gives an even more chilling, more specific example of the kind of senseless suffering inflicted in the concentration camps. And that just occurs to me that if you haven't read Leonard Peikoff's book, The Ominous Parallels, which I think shows the same point, though he's not stressing the nature of evil exactly, but he does stress the nihilism in his book, The Ominous Parallels. And so check that out. And then I mentioned just kind of common version of like Schadenfreude, like the fact that there's a word for enjoyment in other people's suffering. And it's not, people don't use it in the context of like you see a murderer get the chair and that's Schadenfreude. It's usually somebody who's, you're seeing somebody who's confident, successful, happy, get theirs and kind of take them down a notch, take the confident person down a notch. That's the kind of more commonplace way that you see it. And that's a touch of evil in somebody's character. And if it's characteristic of them, then that's a version of real evil. And here again, what I'm stressing is the way in which there's no positive there. Seeing them taking down a notch does nothing to improve my life. And yet that is a real human emotion and can be a real human motivation. So before I get to kind of Ayn Rand's analysis, just a couple features of evil that are recurrent in her books, and then we'll start to put these together. But the most obvious one is kind of a dual perspective, which is there's vanity and concern with prestige and deep self-doubt, touchiness, and the need to feel superior to others. And so it's kind of like what Brandon in his works when he was writing for the Objectivist newsletter and the Objectivist called pseudo self-esteem. It's this kind of pretense at self-esteem that you see through the vanity, but it's really this, I feel inferior and need to feel superior. An anti-effort mentality. So if you just think about, in the scene with Betty Pope, James Taggart's boredom, purposelessness, and what we'll see is, and I think I'll talk a little bit about when we get to kind of the source or nature of evil, but this is definitely something Onkar highlights in his piece, is the way in which the only time you really see them motivated and active is precisely when they have the potential to destroy, when they're contemplating destruction. That's what gets their juices flowing. Another aspect of the anti-effort is a complete disinterest in what's true. They'll even be, some of them will be interested in ideas, but it's, as we'll see, it's ideas as weapons primarily. It's not, I want to know what's true. It's mental passivity and complete disconcern or lack of concern for the truth. And then it's desire for the unearned materially and the unearned spiritually. So it's that, James Taggart is after unearned wealth, or boils after unearned wealth. But then if you get a character like Lillian Reardon, she's not after wealth. It's that they want unearned. This is the whole idea of prestige. It's unearned greatness in other people's eyes, unearned self-esteem. And so if you think about Leonard's discussion of cause and effect and the phenomenon of reversing cause and effect, it's that the part of what is going on is it's the search through kind of material achievements, if you want to put it that, in the quest for unearned spiritual achievements. So the playboy type womanizer who, in Ayn Rand's memorable phrase, sleeps with sluts, that is really after personal value, that is the kind of source of love and romance. Or it's the person who's after wealth in order to feel that, oh, this proves I'm intelligent. This proves I'm a creative achiever. I wrote a piece on Steve Jobs and Bernie Madoff. I think it's called Steve Jobs, Bernie Madoff, and Wall Street Greed. And I show through quotes from Madoff himself the way in which this was definitely a big part of his psychology. It's that he wanted to be thought intelligent. He wanted to be thought a good investor. He wanted the unearned spiritually, and so pursued the unearned, much more even than the unearned materially. Then power lust, right? They want control over others, and they want to exercise control over others. And a lot of their activity and their motivation comes from increasing their power and then exercising their power. And then finally, we get ideas as rationalizations and as weapons. So it's rationalizing to themselves and others that what they're doing is good, or that they couldn't help it, that it was necessary, that they don't deserve blame for it. And then it's as weapons, it's to take Dagny and Francisco down a peg. It's to justify taking away their freedom, taking away their wealth. So it's ideas as weapons. And of course, what we see in Atlas Shrugged is that the two nuclear weapons of evil are mysticism and altruism, or mysticism and the morality of sacrifice. So I want to talk then finally about Ayn Rand's kind of analysis of the source of evil. I've touched on elements of it, but I want to kind of bring it together relatively briefly. In my original preparations for this, I went back to Galt's speech and went through the whole, if you think about Galt's speech as falling in 4 roughly sections, where you get the morality of life, the morality of death, the teachers of the morality of death, i.e. the mystics of spirit and the mystics of muscle, and then the 4th, you get the need to choose one or the other. I went through the whole sections 2 and 3 super closely and in great detail, and I was tempted to make this video go into the whole development, and I didn't for a few reasons. One of which, it just would have been insanely long. And second, I don't know that you would have come away with her perspective on evil, because I don't think you'd be able to hold it. I think you would lose track of the central line, and I didn't want that to happen. But just a word on that, and I'll say more about this in a separate video. I had the experience going through Galt's speech and really digging into it and trying to put every step in my own words and get exactly the logical connections between the points and the overall argument as a really, I mean, I've read Galt's speech many times. I knew from looking at, the outlines other people had produced, its basic structure. But when I was really just doing it all myself, I really had kind of some huge breakthroughs, and not just breakthroughs in specific points, but breakthroughs in how I was holding objectivism. And if you think about OPAR, we've said it's the kind of final perspective on the whole system of objectivism, with the polemics kind of cordoned off and not emphasized, and every ounce of anything that's not philosophy and Rand taken out, so that it's only philosophy, primarily objectivism in its final form. And one of the things I've tried to do in these videos is say that's crucial, and I am trying to bring that out in the videos, but it's not the only way that one can think of and look at objectivism, that there's also the development of it and different ways of Ayn Rand thinking about these ideas and developing these ideas over time. There's different kinds of emphases, and there's elements that she has that are not philosophy, particularly things in psychology that are informing her view of the world. And then there's the negatives, and a real in-depth view of the negatives that she's opposing. And so if you read Galt's speech, you're getting a lot of the psychology, and you're getting in particular a deep, in-depth analysis of the ideas she's opposing, and the way that those ideas function in the minds and souls of individuals and in a culture. And one way to think about it is that from OPAR, you can get objectivism as a system, and from Galt's speech, what that uniquely gives you is kind of X-ray vision into ideas in the world and how ideas shape the world and shape human beings in the world. And it's not that it's all, this is not a either or. I think you can get elements of both from both, but that the particular unique value of somebody studying OPAR that you can get from spending time with Galt's speech and really digging into Galt's speech is this kind of X-ray vision, in addition to a number of other values. And so I highly encourage everybody to go through Galt's speech, and I'm definitely going to go into some depth in her analysis of altruism, either in our next video or immediately after in a separate video. I just have to see how much time will be involved in delivering the material. But for now, I just want to give, let's look at kind of her key analysis of how evil works. So we said that it's hatred of the good for being the good. It's destruction for the sake of destruction. And she sees that as this is rooted in the choice to focus or not. And so how does that work? Well, you have a person who's characteristically anti-effort, evasive. They don't want to exercise the effort to know. The only effort they will exercise in the primary sense is the effort not to know. So it's evasion in order to sustain drift. And so what it is, it's a person more and more in the grips of emotions. And since they're doing this over time, they're like, if you just evade, as if you're characteristically a thinker and you evade some fact, it's not that you're going to like run out and kill somebody or become James Taggart or something like that, because there's still a lot of cognitive content there. You're not in control of it any longer, and you need to correct it if you want to live and be happy. But it's when somebody's kind of, the way Onkar's put it, is doubling down on evasions, and particularly sustained evasions over time, they're more and more in the grips of emotions that they don't know where they're headed. Now, why would a person engage in evasion? Or what is a person after when they're engaging in evasion, particularly when they're trying to live in a state of, or when they're trying to live in a state of drift sustained through ongoing evasion? And it's that that it's the idea we've talked about of the I wish over the it is. And it's not just on one particular issue, that when we're talking about somebody who does this characteristically, what they're longing for is a universe where thought isn't required to live in it. And part of what you get in Galt's speech, though I'm not going to go into it too much here, is that if you think about the whole metaphysics of mysticism, and it's and you can take like the Christian heaven as an example, or the Garden of Eden as the example on earth. It's a world where effort isn't required, and where your wishes are automatically granted to you. And that's their kind of nirvana. That's their ideal. But what you get in Galt's speech is the idea of, well, look, the fact that you have this fantasy where that actually works out doesn't change the fact that what that means, what you're after on earth, is death. That is what it means to desire a universe where A is not A, where effort's not required, where your wishes make it so, where consciousness has primacy over existence. It's the wish not to be in reality. It's the wish not to be. It is the wish to die. And so if you think about what kind of emotion that is going to produce, that kind of orientation to reality, it's resentment of the requirements of living in reality. And so to hide that from themselves and others, what we get is that there's kind of two things that will often go on. One is, because that's such an ugly motive, they'll fake concern with values. If you think about something like money, for example, it's James Taggart telling himself, no, I'm just like you, Francisco. How can you say that there's a difference between us? I'm just making money just like you are. I'm not a bad guy. But they're only pursuing those values so long as they can achieve them without thought and effort, right? And the second issue is that they pretend that they're superior to the thinkers, to the value creators and value pursuers, because they get the same result without effort. So again, think of Taggart and Francisco. His attitude, and I think he's telling Cheryl this, where he's saying, like, I can make $1 billion in a blink of an eye. I just get a special favor from the government. And it's that kind of idea of like, I'm after values, and my way, my anti-effort, my anti-reason way is superior because it's easy. It doesn't take any effort, and so it's better. And that makes me better than the Franciscos of the world. But there's an awareness then that, well, how is he getting his money at a snap of a finger from the government? Well, it's by taking it from somebody who had to have created it. So there's an awareness that the producers exist and that he's dependent on them, that he would not be able to snap his fingers and have his wish if it weren't for the thinkers and producers that he's saying that he's superior to. And so what you get then is a compulsion in order to sustain that evasion, to go to war with them and not to steal their fortune, but to make them lose it, to prove, no, my way really is better. You're no longer rich, Francisco, and I am. But the I am is almost in parentheses. The primary is you're not rich anymore. I've taken you down. I've shown that your way of life, this alleged way of living by reason, that doesn't work. That's not efficacious. It's my wishes that are efficacious. And then the kind of final stage of like really reaching the state of evil is that they want to show that reason itself is impotent. And I've kind of alluded to this, in order to justify their own irrationality. And it's precisely because the existence of the rational, the efficacious, the moral, that is the happy, is a reproach to them. It's a reproach to their whole mode of life. And then what they're using then to rationalize all of these ugly motives and all of these vicious things all along the way are anti-reason ideas, in particular any form of mysticism and any form of sacrifice, whether it's religious, secular, collectivism, anything that demands sacrifice, they'll latch onto to say that it's a cover for their lust to destroy. No, I'm out for the good. I'm sacrificing people for the greater good. And it's a weapon to help them destroy. Francisco, you're bad because you're selfish. You're bad because you're greedy. I'm better because I'm not. And so what you see here, and I've left out certain aspects of it, and there's a lot more detail to it that you get in Galt's speech. But that's the real essence, is that somebody motivated, or somebody who's characteristically evasive and in grips of emotions, is by a process of logic, in effect, led to be more and more at odds with reality, more and more moved by hatred, and that hatred directed at reason and values, and therefore to prove their superiority, to justify their way of life, they want to destroy that. And in order to make this possible, both to themselves and to others, they need to rationalize and attack using anti-reason ideas, and in particular mysticism and altruism. So that's kind of an overview of Ayn Rand's view of evil, how it develops and its nature. The final thing I'll say is that then this is going to be the root of her view of the impotence of evil, that because it's the irrational, because it doesn't achieve and is not even intended to achieve any positives, it has no power of its own. It is a parasite on the positive. It's a parasite on the good. And the only way for evil then to flourish, to the extent you can use such a word in this context, is with the sanction of the victim. It's the producers, the good, and mixed people, to the extent that they're good, to the extent that they give their sanction to evil. And often this is through giving their sanction to ideas of mysticism and altruism, or mysticism and sacrifice. They're the ones who make it possible for evil not to just kind of destroy itself, working, in some back room somewhere, or loafing on the couch and dying of a drug overdose. And so the solution to evil is precisely, as we'll see, to be a person of justice. And part of justice is not sanctioning evil. So with that, we went quite long on this one, but believe me, not even probably half of what I had initially planned on. Hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that bell so that you don't miss a thing. And as always, the best way to stay in touch is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk next time.